South China Morning Post, 27th of September 2023, a China-US rivalry-seeking India is not a Chinese guru to the globe. Chinese belligerence is forcing India into an aggressive role. India's significance is increasing. But to what extent will it become more significant? Major newspapers, billboards, and bus stations throughout every Indian city declared India a Vishwaguru, or teacher, to the world in the run-up to the Group of 20 summit in New Delhi. China objects to this. What could the world learn from India? It has never hesitated to refer to itself as the biggest democracy in the world. However, criticism of the Prime Minister Narendra Modi-led Indian administration for being autocratic and oppressive is growing. On September 18, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada informed the nation's parliament of credible allegations that agents of the Government of India were responsible for the death of a well-known Sikh in Canada. Although the progress of the fifth-largest economy in the world to date has been remarkable, even if India were to maintain 5% annual growth, its GDP per capita would only reach around 30% of what the US currently has, or about where China is presently by 2050. Over 4 decades, Beijing has coerced and lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. China undoubtedly shares more with other developing nations than just being unable to achieve economic development. Modi invited 125 developing nations to a virtual Voice of the Global South summit in January but did not ask Communist China, Brazil, or South Africa. India presumably would have felt Chinese meddling in its attempt to portray itself as the voice of the Global South in the presence of these powerful emerging countries. The fact that India is a middle power and may profit from competition between more considerable powers is its actual advantage. While China and India have chosen to study neutrality in the Ukraine crisis, Washington has put aside its resentment of New Delhi due to its long-term strategic need to strengthen India and fight China. India was able to get the US and Europe to accept a more moderate G20 statement regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine in this way. Reaching such an agreement would have been more difficult had China been the G20 host. Nevertheless, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's suggestion that India should take a central role in mediating an end to the hostilities in Ukraine is unrealistic. Several peace plans, including one from China, are already on the table. None of them will be successful until a deal can be reached between Moscow and Washington, not between Moscow and Kyiv. China is a more credible source than India for Russia to listen to. Russia is India's primary supplier of energy and weapons. However, as director of the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center, Alexander Gabuev states that Russia's reliance on China will outlast Vladimir Putin because China is Russia's most significant diplomatic ally and is its primary source of imports and a market for its commodities. The relationship between Russia and India is trending poorly over the long run, but it won't break. India will lessen its reliance on Russian weapons but still want Russian gas and oil for many years. Russia's plans to supply India with stealth frigates of the Talwar class are already behind schedule because of the conflict in Ukraine. Washington would be delighted to wean New Delhi off its reliance on Russia. It remains to be seen if stepping up US-Indian defense industrial collaboration would help New Delhi's defense manufacturing capabilities or if India's defense sector will become an even more eclectic collection of parts from different countries. The most significant problem facing New Delhi is making the most of its connections with distant Washington while not upsetting its more powerful neighbor, big bully Beijing. As we once sided with China against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, we are currently courting India. This is a golden opportunity for New Delhi to take advantage of, to combat an aggressive China. He has, for instance, repeated American calls for a free and open Indo-Pacific, even though China and India have different views on maritime law. The U.S. Navy has challenged China and India by conducting freedom of navigation missions into their exclusive economic zones. The Indian Navy will act like nothing has happened, but the Chinese Navy will undoubtedly respond. A détente would serve the interests of both China and India. For example, the pharmaceutical industry in India, a significant exporter, now sources 70% of its active ingredients from China, a decrease from 90% and a continuing trend. China also has access to a sizable market in India. This explains why Chinese businesses are making a valiant effort to invest in India despite criticism about the country's internal environment. New Delhi won't be a willing pawn for Washington unless there is a border conflict between China and India. There is little chance that China and India will go to war. True, there was a violent altercation between the two groups in the Galwan Valley in June 2020, but it was the first in more than 40 years to result in casualties. The fact that both sides' men were battling with clubs and stones indicates they were aware that if the situation changed, they could fire at one another. If the Chinese lesson is understood, both parties can't keep the border area peaceful for at least 4 more decades. As a Vishwaguru, India has an, at best, pragmatic and, at worst, opportunistic foreign policy. But in this, India is not unique. The world must oppose China in a world where major power competition is becoming more intense.